The Dolphin Reader. Preface. Composition readers are among my favorite books, but not for teaching composition. They generally include a miscellaneous collection of fine essays, and I read them with the same sort of pleasure with which I read The New Yorker or The Atlantic or Harper's. Whether the nominal arrangement is rhetorical or thematic, they are essentially anthologies filled with essays that are wonderful individually, but are as disengaged from one another as strangers in an elevator. A thematic reader will have a dozen essays collected as an education unit, but the teacher may find that no two have enough in common to provoke the sort of discussion and debate that can give students substantial issues to write about. A decade of using such readers has shown me that teaching from them is like trying to start a fire by rubbing one stick together. The Dolphin Reader is first and foremost an attempt to solve this problem. Each of its 12 units explores a theme interesting to all thoughtful people, and each selection contributes substantially, though not always gravely, I'm glad to say, to the exploration. This is not an anthology of literary masterpieces, though it includes a number of those. It is an invitation to hard thinking and thoughtful writing. The great challenge has been to draw writers as diverse as Plato, Martin Luther King Jr., Jane Jacobs, and Gretel Ehrlich into a conversation. The great pleasure has been to imagine the contributions that students will make to the conversation. As the thematic units developed, it became clear that they would be richer for the addition of fiction that mirrored their themes. The selection of stories was particularly difficult, but the result was an unexpected bonus. The Dolphin Reader contains, dispersed among its thematic units, a brief introduction to fiction that illustrates all the principal elements: point of view, setting, character, symbol, and irony. The writers represented include classics like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ernest Hemingway, contemporaries like Alice Munro and Evan S. Connell, and important international figures like Nadine Gordimer and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The apparatus in the Dolphin Reader is as unobtrusive as editorial and typographical ingenuity can make it. We have glossed what seemed necessary, but not what is easily findable in the dictionary. The only unfamiliar elements of the apparatus are the annotated table of contents, the end of unit commentaries and questions, and the browser's index. All of these are designed primarily as maps to help students find their way to interesting and useful selections. What we had to communicate to the teacher, we put into the guide to the Dolphin Reader. I can't begin to thank all the people whose thoughts helped to shape the Dolphin Reader, but I do especially want to thank the following colleagues, whose comments both informed and heartened me: Michael Allen, Worcester College; John P. Bodner, Prince George's Community College; Neil Daniel, Texas Christian University; Kitty Chen Dean, Nassau County Community College; John Dick, University of Texas, El Paso; C.R. Embry, Truckee Meadows Community College; Patricia Hampel, University of Minnesota; Muriel Harris, Purdue University; Michael Johnson, University of Kansas; Nancy C. Martinez, University of New Mexico; and Linda Peterson, Yale University. Special thanks go to Melody Daly, whose assistance on the guide to the Dolphin Reader made an impossible task a pleasure, and to W. Raymond Smith, whose biographical notes on our authors testify to his energy and ingenuity. Above all, thanks to my editors at Houghton Mifflin, who were helpful, supportive, and brave. Doug Hunt. Introduction: about essays and essayists. Ask most people what an essay is, and they will tell you what it is not. Not a whole book, not a short story, not a poem, not a play. A more positive definition is difficult because the essay resembles other forms of writing and mingles with them freely. A poem looks like a poem, with plenty of white space on the page and lines of irregular length, and a play looks like a play. Flannery O'Connor begins Revelation like this: The doctor's waiting room, which was very small, was almost full when the Turpins entered, and Mrs. Turpin, who was very large, made it look even smaller by her presence. Her bright little black eyes took in all the patients as she sized up the seating situation. We hear the machinery of fiction, setting, character, and point of view humming smoothly in the background, and we settle down to read a short story. But very often, we are well into an essay before we recognize it for what it is. It may look like just another letter, textbook chapter, book review, encyclopedia entry, lecture, or magazine article. Indeed, it probably will be one of these things. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, a widely admired essay, was an open letter addressed to 8 clergymen. W.E.B. Du Bois's Jacob and Esau was a commencement address. Joan Didion's Georgia O'Keeffe was a column for the Saturday Evening Post, written, as columns always are, against the deadline and specification of length. The essay was once a leisurely literary form. Today, it has put on street clothes and sensible shoes and got itself a job. But beneath even the most modern exterior, every essayist is a good deal like Montaigne, the Frenchman who christened the form 400 years ago. He called his writings essays, French for attempts, because they were not reports of objective truth, but explorations of his own attitudes and thoughts on such subjects as cannibals, war, women, and hatred. Essayists in every era have been drawn to subjects where the facts do not speak for themselves, but must be measured against some personal frame of reference. The writer of a news story often gives us bare information. The journalistic formula is who, what, where, when, why, and how. But the essayist reserves a good deal of attention for other questions. So what? Why should I care? What does this tell us about how we should live or about how we do? These are moral questions, not in the sermonizing sense, but in a broader sense. They are concerned with our mores, the customs, habits, and preoccupations that give life its shape. Some essayists state a moral thesis at the outset, as Russell Lynes does in The New Snobism. Snobbery has emerged in a whole new set of guises, for it is as indigenous to man's nature as ambition and a great deal easier to exercise. Others, like C.S. Lewis in The Inner Ring, provide a ladder on which we climb toward the thesis, rung by rung. Still, others, like Annie Dillard and Edward Hoagland, seem to accumulate meaning as they wander through a series of anecdotes and observations. Finally, though, we see that the writer has led us to a statement of values. Questions of value must always be referred to the individual head and heart. They cannot be approached in a purely objective way, as G. K. Chesterton once pointed out. We can learn a good deal about entomology without being insects, but if we want to understand humanity, we have to be human ourselves and project our understanding from the inside out. Facts, figures, charts, diagrams, quantifiable experiments, these can sometimes be useful, but they can't tell us how we should react on the day that the Supreme Court orders the desegregation of public schools, or men land on the moon, or the United States invades Cambodia, or a professional football team signs a quarterback for $7 million. They can't help us sort out the enigma of our own identities. They certainly can't help us order our minds when we face some personal tragedy. To think well about such things, a person needs a perspective, a considered opinion large enough to hold the particular event in its jaws. Perspective transforms an article into an essay. This talk about perspective sounds obscure enough to need an example. Samuel Johnson, the 18th century essayist, was half blind and scarred from infancy by a skin disease, and for the first half of his life was poor and nearly friendless. The weight of this personal experience was behind his grim observation that human life is everywhere a state in which much is to be endured and little to be enjoyed. Everywhere Johnson looked, he saw lives following a familiar trajectory, rising from unhappiness to the pursuit of some unreachable pleasure, and sinking once more into unhappiness. His essays, and sometimes even his individual sentences, are shaped by this trajectory. Hope is itself a species of happiness, he once began, and then let the air out of the balloon by adding, perhaps the chief happiness which this world affords. This pessimism goes further than most of us are willing to be taken, but the perspective it provided made Johnson a formidable essayist and conversationalist. No one could size up a situation more quickly. When he had to explain the significance of the Great Pyramid, he pronounced it a monument to the insufficiency of human enjoyments. Evidence that even the pharaohs were unhappy and had to amuse the tediousness of life by forcing slaves to lay stone upon stone for no reason. When he heard that a friend had remarried, he said that it was the triumph of hope over experience. One of the better lines in the history of black humor. When he wrote an essay on the dangers of affectation, he compared the pleasure of an inflated reputation to the ice palace raised by the Empress of Russia. It was for a time splendid and luminous, but the first sunshine melted it away. If Johnson's perspective had been merely internal and emotional, he might have been an obscure depressive instead of a famous writer. The world has plenty of people in it who have been driven to despair. One Bleat Moore would hardly have been worth noting, but by reading and thinking, Johnson had connected his private experience with two of the great traditions of Western thought, Stoicism and Christianity, duty and faith. Through Marcus Aurelius and St. Paul, he had reached an understanding of life, and he honed his understanding in discussions that were sometimes long and loud. Johnson was never afraid of an argument. After a long night at a tavern, he said to James Boswell, "Well, we had a good talk." Boswell answered, "Yes, you tossed and gored several persons." Thus, his perspective was both personal and universal. He had his own statement to make about human misery, but it was a statement enlarged by reading, talk, and observation till it became, as Boswell said, true, evident, and actual wisdom. In their time, Johnson's essays were read and admired everywhere that English was spoken. Today, they are out of fashion. But if you blow the dust off one of the old volumes and read it patiently, you can learn a good deal about the human condition. Not every essayist is so gloomy, thank goodness, or writes from a conviction about life that is as sweeping. But we can see in Johnson's case one of the defining characteristics of the essay, that the writer uses a particular topic, like the Great Pyramid, as a way of expressing an insight of general interest, the insufficiency of human enjoyments. Assign 3 competent encyclopedists the task of describing the Grand Canyon in 500 words, and you'll get 3 articles that are more or less interchangeable. Ask 3 essayists what they did on their summer vacations, and if you're very, very lucky, you'll get In the Country, The Way to Rainy Mountain, and Once More to the Lake. Roger Angle will show you how devotion to a game enriches people's lives. Scott Momaday will reflect on the fate of his Kiowa ancestors, and E.B. White will remind you of the sweetness of life and its shortness. An essayist approaches a topic the way a carpenter approaches an old barn, estimating the board feet it will provide towards some project already forming in his or her mind. No insight, no essay. This is an uncomfortable truth for people of ordinary humility. When you sit down to write an essay, you may wish that you had traveled as extensively as Jan Morris or grown up in China like Pearl Bach. You may wish that you had H.D.F. Quito's depth of scholarship or Richard Selzer's experience as a physician. You may even wish for a moment that you had led a life as miserable as Johnson's. Then when it came to insight, you would have some cards to play. In fact, all of us have 3 good cards. First, our lives, however ordinary they seem to us, are unlike the lives of others. Our experiences touch at different points on the large issues that affect all lives. Perhaps you grew up in a small prairie town and have seen issues of race and class from an angle no New Yorker ever knew. Perhaps you attended a parochial school and watched the sisters react to feminism. Perhaps you have been a victim and have a statement to make on crime, or a technophile irritated by the technophobes around you. Whatever you are, it is one card you have to play. Your second card is that you live in an astonishingly communicative culture. The airwaves are crowded with songs, advertisements, soap operas, news programs. The campus is buzzing with conversations about movies, books, politics, sex, teachers, and fashion. And of course, there are the library and the bookstore. Some of the ideas floating in this great flood of words will surely be useful. Some will not. Writing about status or friendship with an insight from a deodorant commercial is setting to sea in a very small boat. If you're trying to explain the curious popularity of stabbings and shootings on television, you're not likely to get a large enough frame of reference from a People magazine story. Even a large idea is useless as a tool unless you see how it fits into the vast conversations that are going on around you. Here, I hope, is one way that the Dolphin Reader can be of practical help. The selections are not chosen solely because they are classics or because they have achieved some special brilliance of execution, but because they actively contribute to one of these perennial conversations. All the essays in the progress section, for instance, are part of a familiar argument. X claims that technology is creating more problems than it is solving. Y claims that X is a hypocritical romantic who wouldn't dream of giving up his blow dryer or computer or nuclear deterrent. Z says that both have a point, but both need to define their terms more carefully. A political debate on defense or energy policy is often little more than a remote branch of this conversation. The discussion of whether to take a camping vacation or to fly to San Francisco may be another. So may a professional dispute over the relative merits of Henry James and Tom Robbins. The progress section explores still other branches, but more important, it traces the conversation to its trunk. Grasp the trunk and you can shake all the branches. get a sense of the tug of war that connects writers as diverse as Thomas Babington Macaulay, E.B. White, and Alice Bloom, and you'll soon find a way to get your hands on the rope. Your third card is time. Listen to the man on the street interviews on the local news if you need to be reminded how hard it is to talk extemporaneously on a subject more complex than the weather. A very few people sound coherent and informed. Most mumble whatever banalities and catchphrases come readily to mind and are embarrassed, I'm sure, when they hear the broadcast. Some of the best writers interview terribly. Bruce Lee of Newsweek once interviewed E.B. White and found him polite, dull, and uncommunicative. The next day, White sent Lee 2 typed pages of crisp answers to the interview questions and a short note of apology. I do not have the gift of oral expression and am almost helpless, except when running paper through a typewriter. Writing gives you time to draft, revise, attack the topic from a different angle, ask for opinions and advice, read what other people have said. If you ransack your brain at first and don't find an insight you can apply to your topic, you have time to make one. Never as much time as you would like, of course. This opportunity or necessity of furnishing the mind is one of the rewards of writing an essay. Cardinal Newman once wrote that a university education gives a man a clear, conscious view of his own opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, and an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. That's a rather grand goal, even for the whole of an education, but every hour spent struggling with an essay should bring you a little closer to it. The evolution of an essay. That struggle, that essaying to clarify the writer's views, should really be included in the definition of an essay. Try to imagine essays in this expanded form. John McPhee's A Sense of Where You Are, for example, would balloon out from its 17 printed pages and encompass interviews with basketball players and coaches, hundreds of pages of notes transcribed, topics written on note cards and pinned to a bulletin board, pages scissored to ribbons and rearranged in 12-hour days of very slow and meticulous drafting. It would be a subject for a long book with few readers, and we won't undertake it here. We can, however, examine the evolution of a short comment written by E.B. White. Comments are unsigned essays in miniature. In The New Yorker, they are written using the editorial we, a practice that tends to make the writer sound like a Siamese twin. White began writing comments in 1927 and so had more than 40 years of experience with them by 1969. Nonetheless, when the magazine asked him to comment on the moon landing that year, it was a particularly difficult assignment. The deadline pressure was intense. Neil Armstrong took his small step to the lunar surface at 10:56 p.m. on July 27th, and the television broadcast of the moonlit walk lasted until 1 a.m. White, who lived on a farm in Maine, had to cable his comment to New York in time for a press run at noon. There were other difficulties. He was a little out of sympathy with the topic. The general response to the moon landing was a burst of pride. But White was not inclined to sound a fanfare in honor of the technological advance. Much of his best writing aims to keep man in a mood of decent humility. One of the observations on the pages he mailed to Bruce Lee was this: I am pessimistic about the human race because it is too ingenious for its own good. Our approach to nature is to beat it into submission. We would stand a better chance of survival if we accommodated ourselves to this planet and viewed it appreciatively, instead of skeptically and dictatorially. Never dictate to a swamp or assume that it has no merit until drained. He didn't share the nationalistic pride that the landing stirred in many Americans. Having seen nationalism cause 2 world wars, he was an advocate of the United Nations. These concerns were clearly on his mind when he sat down to run a first draft through the typewriter. Planning a trip to the moon differs in no essential respect from planning a trip to the beach. You have to decide what to take along, what to leave behind. Should the thermos jug go? The child's rubber horse? The dill pickles? These are sometimes fateful decisions on which the success or failure of the whole outing turns. Something goes along that spoils everything. Something goes along that spoils everything because it is always in the way. Something gets left behind that spoils everything because it is desperately needed for comfort or safety. The men who had to decide what to take along to the moon must have pondered long and hard, drawn up many a list. We're not sure they planned well when they included the little telescoped flagpole and the American flag, artificially stiffened so they would fly to the breeze that didn't blow. As we watched the stars and stripes planted on the surface of the moon, we experienced the same sensations of pride that must have filled the hearts of millions of Americans. But the emotion soon turned to, this was our great chance, and we muffed it. The men who stepped out onto the surface of the moon are in a class by themselves, pioneers of what is universal. They saw the earth whole, just as it is, a round ball in a... But they colored the moon red, white, and blue. Good colors all, but out of place in that setting. The moon still influences the tides, and the tides lap on every shore, right round the globe. The moon still belongs to lovers, and lovers are everywhere, not just in America. What a pity we couldn't have planted some emblem that precisely expressed this unique, this incredible occasion, even if it were nothing more than a white banner with the legend, "At last." Judged as a finished product by a writer of White's caliber, this is a dismal performance. Over the years, I've offered several right arms in exchange for a fragment of White's talent, so it reassures me to see that his first draft sounds flat and sometimes awkward. But of course, he never imagined that this draft would be good. Notice, for instance, that he twice began sentences that he couldn't end. What exactly did our emotions turn to? A round ball and a what? Having no adequate answers, White left spaces and went on. His aim here was to discover the general shape of the comment, to see what he had to say. He may not have found the results very encouraging. The comparison to the family outing in the first 7 sentences attempted to reduce the event to human scale, keeping us in a mood of decent humility, but it was far-fetched. If White was going to get his readers to accept the analogy, he'd have to come up with some more details that make moon trip planning seem more ordinary and domestic. And didn't the passage about experiencing the same sensations of pride sound like a press release from NASA? Readers would surely be suspicious of a writer who parroted the official good cheer, then turned sharply around to say that we had muffed our chance. The draft had an uncharitable tone. It was a self-righteous condemnation of the space program at its moment of triumph. It had some good parts: the stiffened flag, the windless moon, the association of the moon with tides and lovers. But principally, it helped White see what he should be thinking about. What did our emotions turn to? What did they start out as? Was he being a spoilsport? In writing the second draft, White reconsidered both the moon landing and the paragraph, measuring them against his own values of charity, humility, and good humor. He kept the first 7 sentences, but changed the rest substantially. The men who drew up the moon list for the astronauts planned long and hard and well. Should the vacuum cleaner go to suck up moon dust and save the world? Among the items they sent along, of course, was the little jointed flagpole and the flag that could be stiffened to the breeze that didn't blow. It is traditional among explorers to plant the flag. Yet the 2 men who stepped out on the surface of the moon were in a class by themselves. They were of a new race of men who had seen the earth whole. When following instructions, they colored the moon red, white, and blue. They were stepping out of character, or so it seemed to us who watched, trembling with awe and admiration and pride. This was the last scene in the long book of nationalism, and they followed the book. But the moon still holds the key to madness, which is universal, still controls the tides that lap on every shore everywhere, and blesses lovers that kiss in every land, under no particular banner. What a pity we couldn't have played the scene as it should have been played, planting perhaps a simple white handkerchief, symbol of the common cold that, like the moon, belongs to all and recognizes no borders. This draft was truer than the first, truer to White's feelings and to the event. It had been silly to say that the planners muffed the moon trip. Now he gave them their due, acknowledging that they planned long and hard and well. However, much White may have wished that they had not brought along the flag. They had reasons for doing so: the precedent of former explorers, the long book of nationalism, and if planting the flag was a mistake, the astronauts certainly couldn't be blamed. They were following instructions. By making these changes, White avoided the sourness of the first draft. By adding madness to the list of things associated with the moon in the next to last sentence, he went beyond the moon, spoon, June, croon formula of sentimental songs. But the most important revision was in the last sentence. James Thurber once noted that the challenge of writing a comment is to make something that was ground out sound as if it were dashed off. The closing sentence of the first draft was to talk about this unique, this incredible occasion and its white banner with the legend "At last," labored under the burden of its serious political intent. By converting the banner to a handkerchief, White lightened the tone, retained the political note, and kept us in a mood of decent humility, all in one seemingly effortless phrase. He must have felt encouraged at this point in the evolution of his paragraph. But he also saw some flaws. The addition of the vacuum cleaner made the analogy between the family outing and the moon trip a little more credible, but the save the world part of the sentence was a feeble joke, and the final sentence, good as it was, trailed loosely off and lost some of its impact. At this point, White typed a draft to correct these faults. Planning a trip to the moon differs in no essential respect from planning a trip to the beach. You have to decide what to take along, what to leave behind. Should the thermos jug go? The child's rubber horse? The dill pickles? These are the sometimes fateful decisions on which the success or failure of the whole outing turns. Something goes along that spoils everything because it is always in the way. Something gets left behind that is desperately needed for comfort or safety. The men who drew up the moon list for the astronauts planned long and hard and well. Should the vacuum cleaner go to suck up moon dust? Among the items they sent along, of course, was the little jointed flagpole and the flag that could be stiffened to the breeze that did not blow. It is traditional among explorers to plant the flag. Yet the two men who stepped out on the surface of the moon were in a class by themselves and should have been equipped accordingly. They were of the new breed of men, those who had seen the earth whole. When following instructions, they colored the moon red, white, and blue. They were fumbling with the past, or so it seemed to us who watched, trembling with awe and admiration and pride. This was the last chapter in the long book of nationalism, one that could well have been omitted. But the moon still holds the key to madness, which is universal, still controls the tides that lap on shores everywhere, and guards lovers that kiss in every land, under no banner but the sky. What a pity we couldn't have forsworn our little Iwo Jima scene, and planted instead a banner acceptable to all, a simple white handkerchief, perhaps, symbol of the common cold which, like the moon, affects us all. This paragraph had a finished look, and White, considering it finished, cabled it to the New Yorker. When the heat of composition cooled, however, he began to see faults. His attempt to absolve the astronauts of blame by saying they were following instructions was shaky ethically and awkward stylistically. The expression about coloring the moon red, white, and blue was flashy nonsense. The talk about trembling with pride was overblown and hackneyed. The reader would doubt that a generally level-headed writer spends much time trembling. The first 7 sentences, was a mistake. The whole comparison to the family outing was unconvincing, inappropriate, belittling, and with the last sentences in the paragraph now doing all that is necessary to keep man in a mood of decent humility, it was superfluous. Time was very short, but even now, White wasn't content to mend faults. An enthusiastic sailor, he remembered the doctrine of freedom of the seas. He found a way to add impact to the last sentence. He took the paragraph through 3 more drafts. Then he sent another cable saying that the comment was no good as is, and offering to dictate over the phone a shorter one on the same theme but different in tone. Here is the result as it appeared on page 1 of the New Yorker. The moon, it turns out, is a great place for men. 1/6 gravity must be a lot of fun, and when Armstrong and Aldrin went into their bouncy little dance like 2 happy children, it was a moment not only of triumph but of gaiety. The moon, on the other hand, is a poor place for flags. Ours looked stiff and awkward, trying to float on the breeze that does not blow. There must be a lesson here somewhere. It is traditional, of course, for explorers to plant the flag, but it struck us, as we watched with awe and admiration and pride, that our 2 fellows were universal men, not national men, and should have been equipped accordingly. Like every great river and every great sea, the moon belongs to none and belongs to all. It still holds the key to madness, still controls the tides that lap on shores everywhere, still guards the lovers that kiss in every land under no banner but the sky. What a pity that in our moment of triumph we couldn't have forsworn the familiar Iwo Jima scene and planted instead a device acceptable to all, a limp white handkerchief, perhaps, symbol of the common cold, which, like the moon, affects us all, unites us all. This is certainly not the best comment White ever wrote, but like all his comments, it is compact and lively. Of the 305 words of the original draft, 15 survived to the final draft. This is a fairly low survival rate, but hardly unique. The journalist James Fallows estimates his survival rate for a long essay at about 1%. Joan Didion, the novelist and essayist, says that there is a point in the writing of a new piece where she sits in a room literally papered with false starts. What is important here is not the survival rate, but the rethinking. It isn't merely White's recording of his reaction to the moon landing that changes from first draft to last. The reaction itself changes to something more generous and complete. Reading with a writer's eye. Occasionally, we can retrace a writer's steps by examining a series of drafts like White's, but there is always guesswork involved. We would rather hear about the writing process directly from the writer. The About Writing section of the Dolphin Reader allows you to do that. In it, you will find writers talking shop, describing how they work, telling about turning points in their attitudes toward writing, bitterly criticizing the prose of other writers, or enthusiastically expressing admiration. Essays like these, as well as the sort of interviews published in the Paris Review and The Writer, give us glimpses of the writer at work, but they are merely glimpses. Despite 2,500 years of interest and 2 decades of intense research, we can't say precisely how a writer works or how a person becomes a writer. We can say, however, from the testimony of innumerable writers, that reading good prose is one of the keys. You will have heard this so often that I'm afraid you won't hear it properly now. Writers who emphasize the importance of reading good prose don't mean relaxing over a good book or getting a mandatory exposure to culture. They mean devouring good prose, drawing from it interest, excitement, and a fully conscious appreciation of the writer's craftsmanship. The best writer I know is also the widest ranging reader, equally likely to be worked up over a children's book or a philosophical treatise, equally inclined to adapt a phrase from The Wind in the Willows or from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. The selections in the Dolphin Reader will please him. They range from direct narrative to complex argument. One way you can improve your own writing is to observe the skill of writers in this wide range, trying to see in the finished work the lines of its construction, just as an art student will carefully examine a painting to find the artist's brush strokes. The narratives in the Dolphin Reader, both fiction and nonfiction, were chosen to give you a good look at the tools available to the storyteller. Ernest Hemingway's Indian Camp, for instance, uses dialogue so economically that it has become a model not only for fiction writers, but for reporters who must capture a whole character in a few sentences of quotation. In which new era would that be? Nadine Gordimer uses particularly clever shifts in point of view to dramatize the gap between races in South Africa, and Roger Engel uses a more elaborate dual perspective to make In the Country something larger than a report on semi-pro baseball. The symbols and stories by Jose Donoso, William Faulkner, and Nathaniel Hawthorne are so varied that they could form the basis for a seminar on symbolism. Alice Walker, Alice Munro, and William Manchester portray memorable characters memorably. Flannery O'Connor and John Steinbeck use setting brilliantly as an aid to characterization, and so element by element, the Dolphin Reader can serve as a source book for those who want to write narratives or simply to appreciate how they work. The line between the narrative and the essay proper is not always easy to draw, since some narratives are very pointed, and some essays include memorable storytelling. It is a line worth tracing, though, before you set out to write one or the other. Perhaps the best tests are purpose and authorial presence. The narrative's purpose is to give us an experience, not to deliver a message. In the Dolphin Reader, for instance, you'll find several stories that have racism as a theme, and in every case, the writer clearly opposes it. But the story will suffer if we read it merely as a statement of liberal views. When Flannery O'Connor created Mrs. Turpin, she didn't intend her to be simply a specimen of racism any more than a parent wants a daughter to be simply a specimen of childhood. The writer of stories, fiction or nonfiction, is creating a new world inhabited by characters who should have lives of their own. Because she wants us to enter this new world with a minimum of interference from the actual world in which we're sitting as we read, she doesn't remind us that she herself is present, trundling the scenery in from the wings and moving the actors back and forth on the stage. She certainly doesn't harass us with instructions about how we should interpret her story. She is like the ideal companion at the movies. She drives the car, pays for the ticket, and never breathes a word until the show is over. She hopes, almost, that we will forget the story has a maker. As we move across the middle ground between story and essay, we find that the writer's purpose is changing. That what once had been theme has taken on a more argumentative edge and become thesis. The writer no longer wants us to forget his presence and experience the story in itself. He wants to convince us of something and will very likely address us face to face. Garrison Keillor's introduction to Happy to Be Here is close to the borderline. It contains a strong narrative, but is finally an essay. It tells the story of Keillor's struggle with his shelf novel. And in that story, Keillor figures only as a comic character, but Keillor doesn't stay in character. At several points, he steps out of the narrative to talk to us directly to make sure we don't miss his point. The most important of these asides begins with a discussion of the New Yorker's great infield of Thurber, Liebling, Perelman, and White. They were my heroes. 4 older gentlemen, one blind, one fat, one delicate, and one a chicken rancher. And in my mind, they took the field against the big mazumbos of American literature, and I cheered for them. I cheer for them now, all dead except Mr. White, and I still think, as I thought then, that it is more worthy in the eyes of God and better for us as a people if a writer makes If a writer makes 3 pages sharp and funny about the lives of geese, than to make 300 flat and flabby about God or the American people. Keeler takes the podium here, dismisses the actors, brings down the curtain, and tells us what is on his mind. He has a statement to make about the value of humor and modesty. If we aren't moved to consider the statement, the essay is a failure no matter how much the story may have amused us. Whether it is his failure or ours might be disputed. When an essay uses narrative, then, it puts it in harness and makes it pull the plow. And some writers are dismayed by the lack of freedom this situation creates. But as an essayist, you enjoy many compensating freedoms, notably in what the textbooks call voice and tone. As E.B. White once said, the essayist arises in the morning, and if he has work to do, selects his garb from an unusually extensive wardrobe. He can pull on any sort of shirt, be any sort of person according to his mood or his subject matter, philosopher, scold, jester, raconteur, confidant, pundit, devil's advocate, enthusiast. Consider, for instance, the opening sentences of Harry Crewe's essay, Pages from the Life of a Georgia Innocent. Not very long ago, I went with my 12-year-old boy to a Disney movie. One of those things that show a farm family, poor but God knows honest, out there on the land building character through hunger and hard work. The hunger and hard work seemed to be a hell of a lot of fun. The deprivation was finally so rewarding, you could hardly stand it. Clearly, this is not the voice of the pundit or the enthusiast. The writer has taken on a distinct character, mocking, relaxed, earthy. He writes like a man who wears blue jeans and is not too delicate to drink beer out of a can. If you read the whole essay, you'll see how well this voice suits the content. But compare the opening sentence of Cynthia Ozick's We Are the Crazy Lady. A long, long time ago, in another century, 1951 in fact, when you, dear younger readers, were most likely still in your nuclear family playpen, where if female you cuddled a rag baby to your potential titties, or if male, let down virile drool over your plastic bulldozer, the famous critic told me never to use a parenthesis in the very first sentence. Here's a writer introducing herself as a very different person, witty, urbane, ingenious enough to construct an opening sentence that comments humorously on itself. Crewe's sentences are short and relaxed. He seems to take the first word that comes to mind. Ozick's sentence is a grammarian's nightmare, full of interruptions and asides, chutes and ladders, ambushes. She teases with a fairy tale opening. She gets a smile by matching the formal adjective and the colloquial noun, potential titties, virile drool. She separates herself from her readers by reminding them that she is a generation older. Her style, as she tells us elsewhere, is her cabin and her shell, tight, highly polished, brilliant enough to keep the reader at a distance on guard. The two voices are so distinct that reading them is like traveling in two different countries. Even when the writer's purpose is largely informative, and he chooses not to introduce himself directly to the reader, we often find a distinctive voice and tone. Here, for example, is a passage in which H.D.F. Kitto comments on the relatively tiny Greek city-state, or polis. To think on this scale is difficult for us who regard a state of 10 million as small, and are accustomed to states which, like the USA and the USSR, are so big that they have to be referred to by their initials. But when the adjustable reader has become accustomed to the scale, he will not commit the vulgar error of confusing size with significance. The modern writer is sometimes heard to speak with splendid scorn of those petty Greek states with their interminable quarrels. Quite so. Plataea, Sicyon, Aegina, and the rest are petty compared with modern states. The Earth itself is petty compared with Jupiter. But then, the atmosphere of Jupiter is mainly ammonia, and that makes a difference. Kitto was a classical scholar of the first rank. He was also a writer who never forgot his audience. Periodically, he reaches out from the page to jab, tickle, scold, or conspire. In the passage above, after the very English joke about countries that go by initials, he grabs the modern reader by the lapels and gives him a good shaking. We stand to one side like schoolchildren watching a classmate being punished and think how often we have committed the same vulgar error that has earned this punishment. By the time Kitto puts the poor fellow down, and we are probably more adjustable readers, and certainly more alert ones. Rarely will you find yourself in a situation where you want to assume precisely the voice of Kitto, Crewe, or Ozick, but as E.B. White once pointed out, we form our styles by the unconscious imitation of prose we consciously admire. The wider the range of styles you admire, the more options available to you as a writer. The voice and style you adopt will depend partly on your identity, partly on the writing situation and the audience. When he addressed the prisoners of Cook County Jail, Clarence Darrow assumed the voice and diction of the plain fellow who delivers simple truths in simple sentences. To dazzle with a style like Ozick's would obviously have been wrong, but when he later published the lecture, he wrote an introduction very different in tone. Realizing the force of the suggestion that the truth should not be spoken to all people, I have caused these remarks to be printed on rather good paper and in a somewhat expensive form. In this way, the truth does not become cheap and vulgar, and is only placed before those whose intelligence and affluence will prevent their being influenced by it. Since no one reads introductions, this bit of irony has gone largely unnoticed. Writing in the academic world often requires an understated, scholarly voice like Daniel Borsten's or Margaret Mead's. It seems sometimes to require the artificial voice of the specialist. This is unfortunate, since a person whose attention is absorbed by the effort of sounding like a historian, anthropologist, or economist may be too preoccupied to write well. But a good mind can express the special insights of a discipline without clanking around in the armor of its special jargon. John Kenneth Galbraith, as subtle an economist as you will find, says that there is no important insight in economics that cannot be expressed in in plain English. The best academic writers manage, sometimes against terrible odds, to maintain a human voice. The selections in the Dolphin Reader illustrate a variety of voices, styles, and tactics. The new snobism, besides making me smile even while I write this sentence, could be a textbook illustration of classification as a mode of development. On a Greek holiday would do equally well as a model for comparison contrast. The formal diction, elaborate sentences, and weighty allusions to letter from Birmingham jail show us what a writer can do to add gravity to a public statement. Tom Wolfe's firecracker style is King's turned on its head, a blend of parody, hyperbole, and red pepper. Henry David Thoreau, Annie Dillard, and E.B. White are all masters of description. Those of you who relish a good metaphor or simile, should have a field day with this book. I think immediately of Johnson's comparison of an impostor to a man in a leaky boat. Patricia Hample's discovery that middle C is the belly button of the piano, and William Manchester's description of Mencken's hands lying in his lap like weapons put to rest. If you take pains to admire what is good in the essays collected here, you'll surely begin to assimilate some of the technical skills that help make a writer. But I don't want to end this introduction with a suggestion that you treat the Dolphin Reader as a collection of museum pieces. Outside the composition classroom, no one picks up an essay hoping to find examples of extended metaphor or stipulative definition. We read writers who have something to say to us, and we ourselves aren't worth reading until we find our own insights and messages. The principal purpose of the Dolphin Reader is to help you in that search. Francis Bacon long ago identified the spirit in which a writer ought to read, not to contradict or to believe, but to weigh and consider. 3 centuries later, another scientist, Charles Darwin, perfected a method of aggressive reading. When Darwin read a book, he noted on the back flyleaf the page number of any passage that struck him as particularly interesting or provocative. When he had finished the book, he broke its spine, tore out the interesting pages, put them into a box, and threw the rest away. I hope you will use the Dolphin Reader almost as ungently, ransacking it for the parts that can trigger something in your own writing. No one can predict where these will be or what state of mind will allow you to find them. The best discoveries come partly by chance. I spent, for instance, a dreadful morning in committee meetings last spring listening to people explain what is wrong with the university. A distinguished professor of humanities said that the problem was the shift from a culture of readers to a culture of viewers. A science professor with a reputation for severity said that it was a damnable tendency to accept fluff in place of substance. A sociologist said that it was a failure to recognize the demographic characteristics of the new student. The president of the student body said that it was a lack of leadership roles for students. By noon, exhausted and confused, I took a solitary walk to the bookstore and found myself thumbing through a copy of Tom Wolfe's The Pump House Gang. Buried in the introduction was a discussion of stratospheres that turned the day around. Suddenly I saw our morning's work from a fresh perspective, saw each of us isolated in a bubble of defensive pride, busily dabbing at the speck in other eyes rather than considering the log in our own. Under such circumstances, a person might serve the institution better by unlimbering a typewriter at once and shaping the inside into an essay. But the devil caught me by the sleeve and led me back to the committee room. Still, somebody should write this essay, and several others that have slipped through our fingers these last few centuries. Perhaps you will.